At a depth of 11,000 meters, the pressure of the ocean can crush a nuclear submarine like an empty soda can. Total darkness, absolute silence. In 1989, a classified deep-sea expedition sent a manned bathyscaphe, the Argus IV, to the very bottom of the Mariana Trench. They were looking for new geological vents. They expected to find blind fish and microscopic bacteria. Instead, their sonar picked up a massive geometric anomaly. When they turned on their external floodlights, the VHS cameras didn't capture a biological organism. Standing in the silt, 7 miles beneath the surface, was a colossal, heavily rusted radio tower. And the terrifying part wasn't that someone had built a skyscraper of iron at the bottom of the world. The terrifying part was that the tower was actively broadcasting. The year was 1989. The Cold War was ending, but the obsession with dominating the unknown was at its peak. While NASA looked to the stars, a shadow coalition of oceanographers looked down. The research vessel Nereus was positioned directly over the Challenger Deep. It was a floating fortress of steel, CRT monitors, and miles of tangled cables. Suspended beneath the Nereus by a 2-inch thick titanium Kevlar tether was the Argus IV, a tiny titanium sphere, barely large enough for 2 pilots, Dr. Elias Vance and Communications Officer Thomas Reed. On October 12th, the Argus IV began its descent. The descent takes hours. As they dropped past the midnight zone, the ocean turned pitch black. The only connection they had to the surface was a crackling analog radio feed and a slow scan video transmission. Vance's audio logs described the profound psychological weight of the deep. He talked about the abyss pressing against the glass, a feeling that the darkness was a physical, living fluid trying to get inside. At 10,900 meters, just before hitting the bottom, the radio link started to degrade. Not from distance, but from an external electromagnetic interference. Reed noted that the interference had a rhythm. It wasn't random static. It was a structured, repeating sequence of low-frequency hums and sharp clicks. Then the sonar went blind. The screen filled with solid green returns. It meant they were directly in front of an object so massive the acoustic waves couldn't map its edges. At exactly 1400 hours, Vance flipped the switch for the external halogen array. The surface crew watched the grainy black and white video feed on their monitors. Out of the swirling marine snow, a structure appeared. It was made of massive iron girders, welded together in complex geometric patterns. It looked like an underwater version of the Soviet Duga radar array. But it was covered in deep-sea barnacles, rust, and thick, pulsating strands of kelp that shouldn't exist at this depth. 3 seconds later, the tether snapped. The Argus IV went dark. The automated emergency winches immediately kicked in, reeling in miles of slack cable. The surface crew on the Nereus worked in a state of panicked silence. It took 5 hours to pull the bathyscaphe back to the surface. When the Argus IV finally broke the water, it was intact. The titanium sphere wasn't crushed. The hatch was still perfectly sealed. But when they unbolted the heavy steel door, the sphere was completely empty. Vance and Reed were gone. There was no water inside. The air pressure was normal, but the pilots had simply ceased to exist. The only thing left behind was the internal VHS recording deck. Captain Miller ordered the tape to be played in the ship's cramped, windowless communications room. The crew huddled around a glowing CRT television, bathed in its sickly green light. The tape showed the final 40 minutes of the descent. The audio was filled with the deafening hum of the external interference. As the halogen lights illuminated the rusty underwater tower, the interference coalesced into a clear, decipherable audio frequency. It was a broadcast. The tower was transmitting a loop of human voices. But it wasn't a distress signal, and it wasn't Russian. The crew of the Nereus froze in absolute horror as they listened to the tape. The voices coming from the 11-kilometer-deep abyss were their own. The broadcast was a recording of the surface crew, arguing in the communications room, reacting to the disappearance of the Argus 4. The tower wasn't just transmitting, it was broadcasting the future. Or rather, time at the bottom of the ocean didn't work the way it did on the surface. The immense gravitational and atmospheric pressure around the anomaly had created a temporal echo. The atmosphere on the Nereus rapidly deteriorated. They were thousands of miles from the nearest port, floating over a 7-mile deep chasm that was listening to them, recording them, and feeding their own panic back to them. Paranoia is a virus, and on a ship surrounded by endless ocean, it spreads perfectly. The tape didn't end with their conversation. The recording continued, playing out events that hadn't happened yet. The crew listened, paralyzed, as the tape broadcast the sound of their own ship's alarms going off. They heard the sound of heavy metal bulkheads groaning, bending, and bursting under impossible pressure. They heard themselves screaming as water flooded the Nereus. And underneath the screaming, they heard the voice of Dr. Vance, the pilot who had vanished. But his voice was distorted, stretched out, sounding impossibly deep, as if his vocal cords had been modified to speak through liquid. Vance's voice kept repeating a single phrase. "It breathes the dark. Turn off your engines. Let us pull you down." Captain Miller ordered all recordings to be destroyed and commanded the helmsman to start the main engines to leave the coordinates. But the ship didn't move. The Nereus was caught in a massive, localized whirlpool. The ocean's surface, normally chaotic with waves, had become perfectly flat, black, and glassy. The compasses were spinning wildly. The ship's internal intercom systems turned themselves on. Through the static of the ship's own speakers, the same deep, slow rhythm from the underwater tower began to pulse. It was resonating through the steel hull. The entire ship was vibrating like a tuning fork. Crew members began suffering from severe nosebleeds and auditory hallucinations. Some men tried to throw themselves overboard, claiming that the voices in the water were promising them peace, promising them that the pressure wouldn't hurt. The tower wasn't just a receiver, it was a lure. It used the voices of its victims to drag more mass down into the trench. It wanted the Nereus. Captain Miller knew they couldn't break the anomaly's hold while the ship's electronics were responding to the broadcast. In an act of absolute desperation, Miller ordered his chief engineer down to the engine room with an axe. He severed the main power conduits. The Nereus went completely dark. All monitors died. The intercoms went silent. Without power, the ship drifted blindly in the Black Ocean for 3 days. But the electromagnetic grip of the tower was broken. The ocean currents finally pushed them out of the trench's perimeter. When they were rescued by a passing freighter, the official naval report stated that the Argus 4 suffered a catastrophic implosion due to a microfracture in the hull. The classified VHS tape was seized by naval intelligence. The official coordinates of the dive were marked as an underwater hazardous zone, restricted from all future research. But we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the bottom of our own oceans. We assume that deep-sea exploration stopped because of budget cuts and technological limits. But what if it stopped because governments listened to that tape? What if they heard what's waiting at the bottom, building its towers in the dark, waiting for us to drop a microphone? Now, I have a question for you. If you were trapped on a ship, and you heard your own voice broadcasting your death from the bottom of the ocean, Would you listen to the tape to know your fate or destroy it immediately? Drop your answer in the comments below. The most terrifyingly honest answers will get pinned. If this dive into the dark abyss triggered your thalassophobia, hit the like button. It keeps our sonar active. And subscribe to Static Archive before the signal cuts out. Stay safe and don't look down.